For over 70 years, the world was largely defined by American alliances, a global system built on shared values and, let's be honest, security guarantees backed by the full might of the U.S. military. But what if that entire system, the very foundation of the modern world, could be shattered by a single sentence? What if the trust that took decades to build could just evaporate in a week? In the wild political climate of March 2026, a hypothetical President Donald Trump, back in the White House, gives his allies one final demand. It's a demand so audacious, so contrary to the spirit of the very alliances he leads, that it forces every major capital from London to Tokyo to make an impossible choice. This is the story of that ultimatum. This is the story of the demand that shattered an empire and ended the American-led world. To really get how it all fell apart, we have to rewind 9 months, back to a tense NATO summit in The Hague in June 2025. For years, President Trump's one and only focus on allies was money. His message was simple, and he was relentless. They weren't paying their fair share. That old 2% of GDP target for defense spending? In his eyes, that was a joke. He'd been demanding more for years, sometimes throwing out numbers as high as 4 or 5%. To him, NATO was just a transaction, a security service where payment was long overdue. And in The Hague, it looked like he'd finally won. His administration immediately called it a monumental win when the Allies caved. After days of grueling backroom deals, they announced a new framework. NATO members formally agreed to raise defense spending to a baseline of 3.5% of GDP by 2035. On top of that, another 1.5% was targeted for broader security, which covered everything from spy agencies to protecting critical infrastructure. The deal was almost unanimous. Every member state signed on, except for Spain. On paper, it was the ultimate proof that Trump's hardball strategy worked. He had bent the entire alliance to his will. But under the surface, the win was completely hollow, built on some creative accounting and a whole lot of resentment. European nations quickly started finding clever ways to hit these new targets without actually changing their military strength. Germany, one of Trump's favorite targets, began classifying new highways and parts of its federal police budget as security-related. Analysts called it fancy accounting to pump up the numbers. The UK did something similar, rolling its huge intelligence budget and even foreign aid money into its defense math. So yes, the Allies were paying up, but they were doing it their way, and more importantly, they were doing it to manage a problem: the unpredictable American president. This wasn't a renewed commitment to American leadership, it was an insurance payment. President Trump saw the signed deal and the budget numbers as proof of loyalty. He thought he had finally bought their compliance. He was about to learn, in the most dramatic way possible, that he hadn't bought a thing. The new year, 2026, kicked off with a tremor that shook the entire globe. Tensions with Iran, which had been simmering for years, finally boiled over. After what was reported as a series of surgical U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, the region just plunged into chaos. Tehran's response was fast and crafty. Instead of a direct fight it knew it couldn't win, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps put a de facto blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. Using a mix of sea mines, swarms of small attack boats, and the constant threat of anti-ship missiles, Iran effectively choked off the world's most important energy artery. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil flows through that narrow strait. Within weeks, global energy markets were in a free fall. Prices went through the roof, supply chains snapped, and the threat of a global recession was very real. For the energy-hungry economies of Europe and Asia, it was an existential crisis. For President Trump, it was an opportunity. A chance to finally test the loyalty of the allies he thought he now owned. He didn't see the crisis as a shared problem to be solved together. He saw it as a personal challenge and a chance to make them fall in line. The Allies were spending more on their militaries, just like he demanded. Now, it was time for them to use that new gear to serve American goals. In the first week of March 2026, Washington sent out the messages. These weren't requests for a meeting. They weren't invitations to form a coalition. They were demands. President Trump issued a direct and public ultimatum to 7 key allies: the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. He demanded they immediately send warships to the Persian Gulf to join a US-led mission to break the Iranian blockade. He didn't frame it as a matter of collective security. He framed it as a matter of their own self-interest. At a fiery press conference, his logic was brutally simple. "I am demanding that these countries come in and protect their own territory," he declared, "because it is their territory. It's a place from which they get their energy, and they should come and they should help us protect it." The message was crystal clear. This is your problem more than it is ours. The United States was mostly energy independent, but Europe and Asia weren't, so they should carry the cost and the risk of securing their own oil. He was done providing American security for free. The money they pledged in The Hague was just the down payment. This was the first real installment. To make sure they understood he was serious, he added a threat. When a reporter asked what would happen if they refused, he said NATO's future would be very bad. He was drawing a line in the sand. Joining the Hormuz operation was now a test of the alliance's value. For the leaders in Berlin, Paris, and London, the moment they had all dreaded was here. The choice was stark: their own national sovereignty, or an alliance that now seemed to demand total obedience. The response came back faster and was more unified than anyone in the White House expected. It was a firm, crystal clear, and resounding no. The official statements were polite, but the message was impossible to miss. Germany, a nation that had spent 80 years carefully balancing its ties to America and Europe, went first. A spokesperson for the German government put it bluntly: "While taking the necessary action to defend ourselves and our allies, we will not be drawn into the wider war. In the current Iran situation, we are not at the moment considering issuing a maritime security operation. Any military action," they added, "would need a vote in Parliament they had no plans to seek." But it was the unofficial line, leaked to the press, that really said it all. "It's not our war. We didn't start it. We want diplomatic solutions and a swift end." Paris said much the same, calling for a UN mandate and de-escalation. The United Kingdom, normally America's most reliable military partner, gave a lukewarm response about reviewing all options, which is diplomat speak for "we're not doing it." Italy, Canada, South Korea, and Japan all put out similar statements, all prioritizing diplomacy over war. They had all promised to spend more on defense. They had all signed the paper. But what Trump never understood was that for the Allies, that money was for their defense, not for fighting America's battles on command. They saw the Iran crisis as the direct result of an aggressive American policy they were never consulted on. Joining the fight would mean endorsing that policy and accepting their role as a junior partner who had no say, only an obligation to send their people into danger. This refusal wasn't just about one military operation. It was a rejection of Trump's entire America First foreign policy. It was the moment the Allies collectively decided that the price of the American security blanket had just gotten too high. The shockwave from that coordinated no hit Washington like a physical blow. President Trump, used to bending reality to his will, was caught completely flat-footed. His public reaction was a mix of bluster and denial. He tried to spin the rejection as a win for American strength. "This was a great test because we don't need them, but they should have been there," he claimed. In another statement, he insisted, "Well, we don't need too much help, and we don't need any help, actually." But you could feel the fury just beneath the surface. On social media, he complained that his allies refused to get involved with our military operation against the terrorist regime of Iran, even though he falsely claimed that almost every country strongly agreed with what we are doing. When a reporter asked if there would be consequences, he deflected, saying he had nothing currently in mind, but then added a chillingly ominous warning: "I will say that I'm not exactly thrilled." Inside the Pentagon and the State Department, a horrifying realization began to sink in. The alliances that had been the cornerstone of American power for 75 years were, for all intents and purposes, dead. The money, that 3.5% they had fought so hard for, was fool's gold. It had bought them nothing. It was a line on a budget, not a blood oath. The Allies had called his bluff. This was the great unraveling. It was the moment the world learned that America's security guarantee was no longer a sure thing. And more importantly, it was the moment the world realized it had to start building something new. While Washington was still reeling from the diplomatic mutiny, a very different kind of meeting was happening in Europe. What started as a crisis summit in London to deal with the Hormuz fallout quickly turned into a constitutional convention for a new European security order. Trump's ultimatum had given them a terrifying look at a future where America was gone, and European leaders were determined to never be that vulnerable again. The result was a plan so ambitious it was staggering. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stepped into the leadership void and unveiled the Rearm Europe initiative. It was nothing less than a declaration of strategic independence. The goal? To pump an incredible 800 billion euros over the next 4 years into building a European defense force that could operate completely without the United States. The plan was massive. It included a 150 billion euro joint loan program called SAFE, Security Action for Europe, to fast-track investment where Europe was weakest: missile defense, long-range drones, satellite intelligence, and cybersecurity. To pay for all this, the EU triggered an emergency escape clause in its budget rules, allowing member states to pour cash into defense without breaking the bank. 4 major programs were announced, each designed to plug a specific gap left by a retreating America. The European Drone Defense Initiative, the Eastern Flank Watch, the European Air Shield, and the Space Shield, all aimed at building capabilities in areas long dominated by the U.S. European analysts put the new thinking in brutally honest terms. The goal was to make critical American support, like intelligence and command and control, uncritical for Europe. It was about cutting the cords of dependence, one by one. Trump's attempt to force Europe to comply had instead created the very thing he claimed he wanted but secretly feared: a strong, independent Europe that no longer needed to ask America for permission. This is a massive turning point, a moment where the world's power map is being redrawn right before our eyes. The collapse of the old order is just the beginning. So what do you think happens next? Who fills the void left by America? Would it be China, Russia, or a newly confident Europe? Let me know your theories down in the comments. And if you want to keep up with the huge forces reshaping our world, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. The chain of events was fast, brutal, and there was no going back. It started with a paper victory that hit a deep crack in the alliance. It was pushed over the edge by a crisis in the Persian Gulf that set the stage for an incredible demand. That demand led to a stunning, unified refusal, the moment allies chose their own sovereignty over loyalty. And that refusal gave birth to a new Europe, determined to control its own destiny. The ultimate irony is that President Trump's pressure tactics kind of worked. He did force Europe to spend a lot more on defense. But that money didn't go into a new and improved partnership. It became the seed money for Europe's declaration of independence. His transactional worldview revealed a simple truth. You can pressure allies to buy weapons, but you can't buy their loyalty. In trying to make the alliance great again, he accidentally engineered its end, leaving America more powerful on paper, but more isolated in reality than at any point in modern history. And so, we're left with the great, terrifying question of our time. With America suddenly on the outside looking in, who will fill the power vacuum? And in a world without a single leader, will we be more or less safe?